In the misty hills of ancient Britain, where Roman roads disintegrate into forgotten ways and Celtic myths whisper across the breeze, lies one of history's greatest enigmas. The name Arthur resounds across 15 centuries, kindling infinite stories of chivalric knights, enchanted swords, and questing impossibilities. But under the trappings of medieval romance and Hollywood histrionics is a tantalizing question that has obsessed historians, archaeologists, and fantasists in equal measure. Was King Arthur real? Tonight, we travel back through the mist of the past to discover the reality behind Britain's greatest myth, where fact and legend blur like the shadows at dusk, and where one man's life might have formed the very essence of a nation. It is in the smoldering ashes of Roman Britain, circa 410 AD, when the last of the legions marched away over the Channel and abandoned a divided land perched on the brink of anarchy, that our story starts. For almost 400 years, Rome had imposed order on these wild Celtic coastlines, building great cities such as Londinium and Camulodunum, laying down roads that snaked like arteries across the land, and fashioning a civilization that looked as durable as the stones of Hadrian's Wall. But empires, like men, are mortal. While barbarian tribes assailed Rome's frontiers and civil war shook the empire's very core, Britain was left behind, a treasure too far and expensive to hold. The Romano-British ruling classes, who had become complacent under the eagle's wing, now stared into a terrifying reality. They were alone, with enemies within and outside of their walls, and only with the recollection of Roman discipline to pilot them through the gathering shadows. Into this power vacuum came the Anglo-Saxons, savage Germanic warriors who first came as mercenaries invited by desperate British monarchs, then remained as conquerors lured by the prospect of rich lands and dispirited resistance. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes introduced a warrior culture completely foreign to the Romanized Britons. Different gods, a harsh Germanic language, and a complete lack of interest in preserving the crumbling edifices of classical civilization. Archaeological records present a stark picture of this era. Hitherto flourishing Roman cities such as Wroxeter and Silchester were incrementally deserted, their forums covered in weeds, their bathhouses cluttered with rubbish. Roman developments in sophisticated pottery and glass went to no better end than producing these unpolished, locally made slops. Literacy, that hallmark of Roman culture, virtually vanished outside the monasteries. This was the age that historians would later call the Dark Ages, where the light of learning became dim to an ember, and the very idea of a united Britain seemed to dissolve like the morning mist. Yet in this apparent collapse, the seeds of the Arthur legend took root in a most unexpected place. The earliest reference to a warrior named Arthur appears not in the Grand Chronicles of Kings, but in the Historia Britonum, a 9th-century Welsh compilation of historical fragments attributed to the monk Nennius. Here, Arthur emerges not as a king crowned in golden halls, but as a Dux Bellorum, a war leader who fought alongside the kings of the Britons against the Saxon invaders. Nennius credits Arthur with 12 great victories, culminating in the Battle of Mons Badonicus, where he allegedly slew 960 enemies in a single charge. The language is sparse, almost military in its precision, lacking entirely the romantic flourishes that would later define Arthurian literature. This Arthur is a figure of desperate times, a commander who rallied the fractured British kingdoms against an existential threat, fighting not for glory or courtly love, but for the very survival of his people's way of life. The evolution of this dark warlord into the legendary Arthur started with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae in 1136, a book which would turn out to be one of the most influential books of the medieval ages. Composing in the comparative calm of Norman England, Geoffrey drew on Welsh oral myth, classical authority, and his active imagination to produce a biography of Arthur more in the style of an epic poem than a historical record. It is true who is known today, born by the magic of Merlin at Tintagel, armed with the sword Excalibur, ruling Camelot with Queen Guinevere and the Fellowship of the Round Table. Geoffrey's Arthur not only defeats Britain but much of Europe, building an empire as great as Rome itself before succumbing to treachery and civil war. The book was a hit from the start, copied across medieval Europe and translated into many languages, making an unknown Welsh hero into a worldwide icon of knightly virtue. But what about the historical Arthur, if there was one? Modern archaeology has uncovered intriguing evidence that indicates the 5th and 6th century Britain was much more sophisticated than the long-established tale of Saxon invasion and British decline. Digs at places such as Tintagel and Cornwall produce traces of prosperity and global commerce persisting deep into the post-Roman era. Mediterranean ceramics, African oil lamps, and foreign spices that attest to a society still able to maintain advanced organization and global commerce. The enormous earthwork forts located all over Western Britain, such as Cadbury Castle in Somerset and Dinas Powys in Wales, exhibit evidence of refortification during this critical phase, indicating that British leaders were indeed mobilizing resistance against Saxon expansion. These archaeological finds depict a picture of a changing rather than collapsing society, where Romano-British practices accommodated and evolved instead of vanishing under Saxon axes. The search for Arthur's identity, assuming he was historical, takes us to consider several strong candidates who trod the stage of post-Roman Britain. Rhiothemus, a king of the Britons noted by continental chroniclers, led a force of Britons to Gaul about 470 AD to assist the Romans against the Visigoths, and were betrayed by his Gaulish comrades, an echo, perhaps, of the betrayal of Arthur by Mordred. Ambrosianus, the 6th century monk, Gildas' description of a Roman gentleman who mobilized British opposition to the Saxons, is the best fit for a war commander who could have led the decisive battle at Mons Badonicus. Most interestingly of all, recent scholarship has centered on the probability that Arthur is not a single person but a composite figure, a mythic amalgam of various real leaders whose exploits were blended and mythologized over generations of oral retelling. This hypothesis accounts for both the inconsistencies of the early texts and how Arthur's legend appears to take on elements of various times and places in post-Roman Britain. The enduring power of the legend is not so much in its historical enigmas, but in its deep psychological and cultural resonance. Arthur appears at times of national crisis, first at the Saxon invasions, then again at the Norman conquest, when Geoffrey of Monmouth provided the defeated Anglo-Saxons with a golden British pass to challenge their Norman conquerors' claims to legitimacy. The Round Table, that ideal circle where all the knights sit as equals, is a symbol of man's age-old dream of fair rule and brotherhood. Camelot itself is a metaphor for the golden age which forever eludes us, lost not to external threats but to the frailties of man, pride, passion, and betrayal. The search for the Holy Grail transcends Arthur's knights from being only warriors to being seekers of the sacred, raising their adventures from terrestrial conquest to sacred mission. We can observe through this process how legend is not merely entertainment, but is a vehicle for carrying a culture's innermost values and desires. The enigma increases when we reflect upon how completely the Arthur of legend has come to eclipse any historical truth that may have prompted it. Contemporary efforts to find the real Arthur usually tell us as much about our expectations and assumptions as about the past. Victorian excavators, with the certainty that Arthur had to have been a medieval monarch, excavated wildly at places such as Glastonbury Abbey, where monks nicely found Arthur's tomb just as their abbey required capital for rebuilding. In the 20th century, Romantic nationalist-inspired scholars attempted to turn Arthur into a champion of Celtic resistance to Anglo-Saxon domination, while more contemporary interpretations have focused on his status as a unifying presence for people across ethnic boundaries. Every generation finds the Arthur it requires, it would appear, a circumstance which itself reflects the legend's extraordinary versatility and timelessness. As we approach the 21st century, equipped with more advanced archaeological methods and documentary criticism, the question of Arthur's historical existence is left elegantly open. Maybe this is where it should remain. The power of the Arthurian legend lies not in its historical accuracy but in its capacity to inspire, to offer hope in dark times, and to remind us that even in an age of cynicism, the ideals of honor, justice, and self-sacrifice remain worth pursuing. Whether Arthur was a 5th century chieftain who led the Britons against Saxon invasion, an amalgam character constructed from several available historical records, or simply a product of medieval fantasy, it is less important than the fact that for 15 centuries, individuals have discovered in his legend something fundamental to the human condition: the never-ending conflict between order and disorder, the cost of leadership, the ephemeral nature of even the greatest accomplishments, and the belief that somewhere better and someplace else, we might construct a kingdom worthy of our finest ideals. The quest for the historic Arthur goes on, each fresh archaeological find and learned assertion adding another fragment to a puzzle that is perpetually intricate. But maybe the real Arthur does not exist in any specific time or location, but in that realm of timelessness where history turns into legend and legend turns into the truth that passes beyond mere fact. Ultimately, whether Arthur existed is not what we are being asked. It is if the ideals he stands for, courage in the face of insurmountable odds, the vision of just rule, the fellowship of brotherhood that endures beyond personal desire, are still real in our chaotic time. What do you believe? Was Arthur a real person whose legacy was shaped by centuries of legend? Or was he always a product of the human imagination, no less potent for being myth? Let us know your opinions in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this journey back through the fogs of history, do subscribe for further ventures into the world's greatest enigmas. Until then, may you discover your own Camelot, and may the quest never end.